Hi there, Mythfits. Have you ever wondered how I became a writer, or if I always knew that I wanted to be one, or if I went to school for it? Well, if you've ever wondered those questions, then you're going to like the answers that I have today. At almost every event or in every interview that I have ever done, I get asked some version of the question, how did you become a writer? Did you always want to be a writer? Did you always know you wanted to write? Did you go to school to be a writer? All different variations, but they all have the same goal, which is finding out how I became a writer. And today I'm going to answer that. So, the short answer to did I always know I wanted to be a writer is no, heck to the no. When I was growing up, I hated reading, like, despised it, or at least I thought I did. But in retrospect, I really just hated reading the books that I was supposed to read. There were tons of books that I loved reading, like Babysitter's Club, Sweet Valley High, Nancy Drew. But all of those books I was told by so many different voices didn't count. And so I thought I hated reading. And I also thought I hate English and language arts. My first 3 years of school were all in French in Montreal. And when I got to the States, I was like, I don't understand English grammar. I don't get this stuff. And now, in retrospect, I think I just had bad teachers. I did not have teachers who taught me a love of reading or English or language arts or any of those things. So growing up, I was math and science girl. My eighth grade math teacher told my parents that they had to push me to become a professional mathematician, which I'm lucky that they pretty much just laughed in his face because even though I was really good at math, I also hated math. The only thing that I really loved and still love was science. Like, I loved every subject in science. In school, I took 2 years of biology, took earth science, I took 2 years of chemistry, I took physics. I loved all of it. And at various times in my life, I was going to be an astronaut or a veterinarian or a marine biologist or an environmental biologist. All of those things. Like, science was my plan. So, how did this science loving, reading hating girl grow up to be a story and writing obsessed author? Well, it all started with Jane Austen. In my freshman lit class at Columbia, we read Pride and Prejudice. This changed my life. I loved it. I read it. I finished the whole thing, which was really rare for me to do. Even though I got good grades, I did not read the works. But it just totally blew my mind that a book that I loved was important enough to be studied in an Ivy League literature class. Like, this was crazy. And it changed my entire point of view on books in general. It made me believe that a book didn't have to be painful or boring or metaphorical or rhetorical punishments in order to be valued, in order to be worthy. It could be fun. It could be delightful. It could be a romance. It could be a joy to read. And I wanted to be part of that. So, did I immediately become an English major and declare my love for creative writing? Again, no. I actually ended up transferring to the University of Colorado at Boulder and became a theater major, which was pretty much in my blood since both of my parents were in theater. Um, so I did that, and then I ultimately ended up going to graduate school and getting a master's of science. Yes, again, science, in historic preservation, which was basically how to save old buildings. And I did that back at Columbia. So this actually turned out to be a very expensive degree that I did not use one little bit. Like, I have never worked a job in historic preservation since the day I graduated. But it absolutely ended up being worth it for one seemingly insignificant and yet totally pivotal moment. I was in my master's thesis defense, which, if you don't know, it's where your thesis advisors tell you what works and what doesn't work in the first draft of your thesis. Be basically like sitting down with your editor and them telling you, like, this is good and this is needs to change. So at that point in my life, the thesis was the longest thing I had ever written. I think it was maybe around 80 pages with a lot of illustrations, and that felt like a massive novel to me. Um, so I'm sitting there in my thesis defense with my, I think, three advisors who had all read it. And one of my advisors, who was a gentleman with a PhD in architecture from MIT and who was physically incapable of speaking in less than four-syllable words, um, he said to me, Tara, you're a very effective writer. And then the other shoe dropped, and he added, but you have to cut the first half of your thesis. As I said, this was the longest thing I'd ever written, and the idea of having to cut like 20 pages out of this massive work cut me to the bone. But that little compliment saying that I was an effective writer, that stuck with me. I had never really considered myself to be a good writer. Sure, I realized I had never reread or even proofread a paper in my entire academic career until that very thesis, and still got A's and B's, but I'd never really even thought about writing as a thing other than what I had to do in order to get my grades. That compliment that he gave me stuck with me long after I graduated, long after I went back home and struggled to find a job in the field that I had just paid a ton of money to study. I'm a very effective writer. I'm a very effective writer. In that time, post graduation, was also when I started reading a lot. Like, to be fair, I was home alone in the middle of nowhere in the country without much else to do. So basically, every week I would drive into town to the shiny new Barnes and Noble that my town had just gotten, and I would buy a new stack of books, like this tall stack of books. They were almost exclusively romance. Following in the steps of Jane Austen, I was obsessed. I started out reading all of the subgenres: contemporary, historical, fantasy, time travel, like you name it, and I read it. And I slowly circled in on what became my very favorite subgenre: historical romance, which is no surprise considering I loved Pride and Prejudice, which was basically a historical romance. So, between doing all of that reading and having my advisor's comment in the back of my mind, and let's be honest, my inability to find a job at that point, I started thinking, what if I tried to write a book? What if I tried to write a romance book? It seemed like something I could do from where I was in the middle of nowhere. Of course, it didn't happen instantaneously. I didn't sit down and immediately have like the most brilliant idea ever and write it and finish it and send it off and sell it. But it started just with having that compliment in the back of my mind and falling in love with reading again. And so I kept reading. Like, I read as much as I could, and I started learning what I liked, what I didn't like, what I thought worked in a story, what didn't. I started studying. I sought out articles online and advice, which was really hard to find online in the very early 2000s. I'm talking like 2000 to 2002 was really when I started. But I voraciously devoured like every piece of information that I could find, and I started writing. And it took me a few project starts to find one that I finally was able or willing to finish. And it took me a few finished books before I got to the one that got an agent's attention and ended up turning into Oh My Gods. But that's basically how it happened. I don't have an MFA. I have never even taken a creative writing class in my life, but I studied by reading, I studied by absorbing what other writers shared online and in person and in workshops, and I learned by writing. So that's how I became a writer. That's how Science Girl became a writer. So if anyone ever asks me if you can become a writer, then my answer is always going to be yes, because if I could do it without a class, without training, without ever even feeling like I wanted that to be my path in life and end up being a writer, then anyone can. So that's my journey. That's how I became a writer. And I hope you learned something from this. So until next time, stay magical.